Hey, and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership, where we're going to finish off on my discussion of racism and sexism before we get into some real meaty stuff with like Malcolm X and bell hooks. But maybe what I'm talking about is meaty too. In this lecture, we're going to continue on looking at some of those maybe more hidden forms of racism that might be at work in our society and discuss some of the controversial issues. That's it. Now, some of what we've talked about when I've been discussing privilege is also related to structural racism. So here's another form of racism that doesn't necessarily have to do with that explicit or old-fashioned racism or even necessarily with implicit bias. Structural racism is when there's racism built into the structure of the society in which we live, and so you don't actually have to think about it because it's just built in there. Let me give you one of my favorite examples of this, which is about cameras. So it turns out that cameras are not actually set up for black people. I mean, this is true from the very beginning, that like exposure rates and things like that with cameras, even going back to when they had film, they just weren't good at taking pictures of black people. You can see this every once in a while when somebody does a publication or something, when they put a copy of pictures and the black person's face would entirely disappear except for like their smile, and you would see the white teeth extremely clearly in the picture. But this is carried over even into higher technology cameras, where today there are problems with facial recognition. Because facial recognition software works really well on white faces, but it doesn't work as well on black faces. Now, why is this? Is this because there's a group of maniacal racists who are behind camera production here? Well, no, it's actually just built into the system. So on the one hand, cameras are always used with a set of example pictures. So the producer will set their cameras up to a database of different faces and pictures that they have when they're tuning their cameras to figure out what the exposure rate's going to be and such. Well, in the past, there are more pictures of white people than there are of black people, and most databases are filled with more pictures of white people than there are of black people. So when you went to put the camera together, the majority of examples that you practiced on were white people, and it turned out it worked for them, and so the people assumed, well, this will work for everybody, but didn't actually take account like minority faces as much. This has continued on to be one of the problems today, where facial recognition software only works with large databases of pictures in order to draw on. And so if the majority of pictures that it's drawing on are white, it's going to have problems with pictures of black people. But there's another way in which the structure of our society works into this as well, and that has to do with capitalism. So people who make these products want to sell them, and when they want to sell them, well, they're looking for a base of customers that have enough money to buy these things. And we've seen that white people tend to make more money over time than black people do, and in terms of net worth, white people have more than black people. So even if they're not explicitly thinking about race in any way, but only thinking about the market opportunities of selling their cameras, they're going to tend to produce cameras that work best for white people. This doesn't necessarily have to do with explicit or even implicit racism or racist motives in today's society, although it certainly could have to do with that, but it's baked in from past racism and all sorts of things that have come to affect the distribution of goods and income across the society in terms of race. Or take another form of structural racism. So racism in the past has contributed to the existence of people in lives of poverty. I don't think this can be questioned. So then people live in poverty, and as we suggested earlier on, we were looking at the legacies of racism. This has also shaped people into particular ghettoized societies. Well, it turns out that if you have a small impoverished area in a city, that tends to produce crime. And crime tends to lead people to go to prison. And people who are in prison, oftentimes males, like removes males from households and leads to more impoverished people because you can't make money while you're in prison. So that leads to poverty, which leads to crime, which leads to jail, which leads to poverty, which leads to crime, which leads to jail and poverty, crime, jail, poverty, crime, jail. And it just keeps going unless somebody's able to break the cycle. Now note that once this gets started, once racism leads to a kind of ghettoized poverty for black people, then racism actually could entirely go away and it wouldn't break the cycle, because the cycle doesn't depend upon the presence of racism explicitly to do it. It's just built into the structure. To give you a more concrete example here, we could look at drug usage and prison time for drug usage. So it turns out that whites and blacks actually use similar amounts of, say, marijuana, right? But it turns out that blacks are far more likely to go to jail for possession of marijuana. Why would this be? Well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, maybe there's explicit racism involved in this. It's entirely possible, but it's not necessarily the case. As we've established, there's a tendency, because of racism in the past, to lead to a kind of ghettoized existence for black people, oftentimes in impoverished conditions. Well, if those are the conditions in which they live, oftentimes police forces take action to try and control the crime in that area. And so they'll put a larger number of police in that impoverished area. Well, this means that they're more likely to catch all sorts of crime that happen there, even if they're not crimes that happen disproportionately there compared to outside of that area. So even if there are similar percentages of people that are using illegal drugs in that impoverished area and out in a more affluent area, the police are more likely to catch the people that are doing it in the impoverished area. Now, note, again, there's no need for explicit racism to come in at any point. The police have decided to go into this particular area because there's a higher crime rate, which is tied to the fact that there's poverty. But as an outcome of that, they end up sending more people to jail from this particular area, even if it's not the particular kinds of crime that they have more of in that area. And so blacks will disproportionately get sent to jail. It's just built into the structure. Now, it's also true that there have been in the past significant differences in the assignments of penalties for different drugs that often were related, not directly, but indirectly to race. So take crack versus cocaine, for instance. Crack tends to be a cheaper version and is more popular in impoverished areas. And cocaine is a more affluent drug. Rich people do cocaine for the most part. Well, legislators, when they got together to assign penalties for these two, they put higher penalties on the crack than they did on the cocaine. And since the crack was used more in impoverished areas, then people from those areas, disproportionately black people, ended up spending longer in prison. And all of this, of course, feeds back into the cycle that we saw before that was going on. Now, again, these legislators didn't have to be explicitly thinking, ooh, ha, 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 I'm going to put more black people in prison by doing this. It might have been that more of their wealthy donors were concerned about crack than they were about cocaine use. In any case, explicit racism didn't have to work into the system in order to have those racist outcomes. But that doesn't make the racist outcomes any less racist outcomes. Now, while considering structural injustice, we can also go back to an issue that we raised earlier on. So we looked at the fact that females, in fact, make less money than their male counterparts, something on the order of contemporarily, like 77 cents to the dollar or 80 cents to the dollar or something like that. Now, as a justification for this, sometimes people suggest, well, that's because women spend more time with their families and women take off around, say, the birth of a child. And so since they miss work while men are getting ahead, it makes sense that men, in fact, make more money, and there's no sexism built into this, because if the man took that time off of work, well, they too would fall behind in their earnings. Now, it's not clear that that actually works out. I mean, you can control for these variables in other studies, and it still tends to show that women, in fact, make less than their male counterparts, even if there are similar amounts of time taken off. But let's take seriously the claim that, let's say, women do, in fact, take more time off than men. And as a matter of fact, we can see that this is the case. But we might want to go another step further. So this is actually a problem similar to what Wollstonecraft and Nussbaum raised about the distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere. So if women take more time off to care for their sick children, we might also go to asking why that's the case. Is it just that women take more time off? Are they expected by their society to do this, whereas men aren't expected to do it? Do companies provide sufficient time for parents to take off in order to take care of their children, or for people to have babies? And do they provide this both for males and females? So even if it's the case that differences in income are tied to the amounts of time taken off by different genders, that doesn't end the discussion about it. Because it might be that actually sexism is baked in at a much more deep level into the structure of the society in which we live. And maybe that's something that could be fixed. Okay, so at this point I've treated all the tame stuff. I'm assuming that, all that was tame, if you were triggered by the discussion of privilege or, structural injustice or any of that. So now let's take on some of the really controversial things. And the first one that I want to look at is trigger warnings. And I've actually talked about triggers several times already in this video. The category has developed across time, and it wasn't always used for the kinds of things like when you're scrolling through Facebook and get really mad at a meme that your friend posted. But today, that's often the way that it's used. So we ought to rewind back and say something about how it actually started out. So really, back in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a significant amount of research that was done on post-traumatic stress disorder. And this was first done in relation to soldiers who were coming back from war zones, who had experienced post-traumatic stress and were trying to deal with this. And people were trying to figure out what were the best ways to treat those people. Well, trigger warnings started out as a way to deal with people who had post-traumatic stress, especially as this expanded beyond just soldiers, but also to people who had been assaulted at different times in their life, or who had experienced sexual assault. So the idea was that instead of triggering an instance of PTSD, you would give people a warning ahead of time about the content that might trigger those instances. So if in an English class you were going to read a really vivid story about sexual assault, well, you would tell people ahead of time and say, you know what, this has a very vivid picture of sexual assault, and if that would trigger PTSD for anyone, we want you to know ahead of time so that you'll be able to think about that. And maybe if you're worried that this will and you really don't want to go through that, we'll find an alternative assignment for you. And that use of trigger warning seems to me a pretty justifiable usage. But as happens with categories, especially categories that are related to power and moral claims in our society, it tended to enlarge after that. And we came to talk about being triggered by all sorts of things, and not necessarily having an episode of PTSD, but having some strong emotional reaction to something. Now, some of this, again, was a useful discussion. So if somebody's getting up and saying something that denies my basic humanity, well, maybe I have a right to be a little bit triggered by that. But as the category expanded out, there came to be questions about whether this wasn't being used just as an excuse to avoid having to listen to things that you didn't want to listen to, things that you disagreed with. Now, especially in the academy and schools, well, we kind of force you to be engaged with things that you might disagree with. As a matter of fact, through this class, I've talked about a lot of things that I disagree with, but, that's just the way things go. So this becomes a controversial category as we have fights over exactly what people have rights not to have to listen to. What people have rights to protest, what they have rights to drown out, and where that slides into a kind of anti-intellectualism because you just don't want to listen to anybody who disagrees with you from the beginning. There aren't easy answers to these questions. So, for instance, if a student group decides they want to invite the head of the Ku Klux Klan on campus to give a speech about how black people should be put back into slavery, well, is that the kind of thing that the campus should go along with? Is that the kind of thing that the student body should go along with? What does it say about our culture if we give a podium to that person? What does it say about those students who invited the head of the Ku Klux Klan and who black students now have to sit next to in class? These are not easy questions, so I'm not going to resolve them for you, but I do think that they're questions worth asking and having some serious dialogue about. Our next controversial category is microaggressions. So I don't know if you've heard of microaggressions. They were fairly big a couple years ago. Microaggressions have to do with little things that people do or say that end up coming off as and oftentimes being dismissive of other people. And again, this often happens without any intent involved, or at least conscious intent involved. Well, take something that somebody might say to a black person, for instance. If somebody comes across and say, "Wow, you're the whitest black person I've ever known." Well, what does that mean? What is associated with whiteness in this picture, and what's associated with blackness? By that, do you mean that the person is educated and well-spoken? Is that an attribute of white people? And if that's the case, isn't the comment a little bit demeaning to black people, even if you meant it as a compliment to this particular person? Or take, for instance, a fairly basic question like, "Oh, where are you from?" Now, this seems innocuous, right? I mean, if you're asking somebody and they appear not to be from here, but what is it that makes them appear not to be from here? Well, this is an important thing. So if you know that they're an international student, asking it seems like a fine thing to do. But if you're asking the person simply on the basis of what they look like, this can be problematic. The implication seems to be that they just don't belong in the same way that you do. Now, again, this is not necessarily intentional, but it fits with a background structure. So people who aren't white oftentimes get asked these questions, and after it happens several times, they get to be justifiably concerned about it. Or take a basic claim like, "Wow, you're really good at this for a girl." Well, that's kind of backhanded compliment. Now, so lots of these claims are not put forward as harmful. As a matter of fact, lots of them are put forward as attempts at compliments. But oftentimes they're fit to particular structures of our society that, again, if you're privileged, you might never have paid attention to. Let me give you an example from my own life. So I'm an incredibly awkward person, and walking across campus, I often look for things to say to students to try and be, social and pretend that I'm a normal human being. And so there was a girl that I often said, "Oh, hey, you need to smile," because she had the resting bitch face thing going on. I mean, not that what I didn't think about it. She was a fine person, but I often said this, why don't you try and smile? It was only later on that I read in a list of microaggressions that a male saying to a woman that she needed to smile was probably improper. And this has everything to do with who would I say that to? I'm not likely to say it to the big black guy who's walking across campus. "Hey, you need to smile more." No, I would tend to say it to a female, and the idea of outward appearance and looking happy seems to fit with being a female, and in this case particularly a white female. Now, I never thought about it as sexist. I mean, in this case, I'm just an awkward person looking for a way to have a normal human interaction with somebody. But it turns out that that's actually fit with a kind of structure, a set of expectations that are keyed into gender in our society. And again, this was one of those cases where when I realized that this was something that could come across as a microaggression, I immediately felt a little bit self-defensive about it because, that certainly was not my intent. I had never consciously thought that this was a kind of gendered stereotype that I was reinforcing in any way, although actually now I pretty much accept that it was a gendered stereotype that I was in some ways reinforcing. Now, the reason that I put this under a controversial category is for a philosophical reason, because it's not entirely clear where we're supposed to locate the meaning of particular sentences when we're talking about microaggressions. So it might be that somebody feels aggressed against when they haven't been, and it might be that I'm actually expressing an aggressive action when I don't intend to. And of course, there's a big space between these two as well. And I generally think that it should be considered a microaggression when we can identify background structures that the comment fits into and that this actually fits with the particular statement that we have. So we can inject a little bit of objectivity into it. I mean, it's all socially constructed, but a little bit of objectivity, at least in the sense that it's not just subjective perception going on. But at the same time, I haven't been able to formulate that as precisely as I'd like either. And so I recognize a kind of irreducible subjectivism, at least to some of these judgments about whether a particular statement is a microaggression or not. This doesn't mean I don't think that there are clear cases and that we should pay attention to them. I actually find it a useful category for social analysis. But it's also, at least at the present, until we get some more work done on it, a kind of fuzzy or vague concept. And one that I wish we could get a little bit further in fleshing out. In our category of controversial categories, our category of controversial categories, that's what I just said, yes. So I'm going to talk about embodied protests. So some people get immediate reactions to a set of embodied protests, which are often pride protests. Now, in part, I think this might be because of a kind of libertarian tendency in our society to say things like, look, you can do whatever you want to with your life, just don't stick it in my face that you're going to do it, because I'm fine with it as a matter of your liberty, but I don't really approve of it. But I think that that's actually a little bit too simple an understanding of the social dynamics that are often going on in the context of these protests. So usually groups that have embodied or pride protests are participating in them because they have not been able to have public expressions of their pride in the past. And so this is a kind of reaction to an oppressive history. And in part, this does give rise to a kind of recognition of flamboyant aspects of particular cultures and things that might be offensive. And in part, that's the point of the action, is to actually say, you know what, I might be offensive to you, and yet I am going to celebrate this particular right that I have. Now, I don't think that this is always healthy, but I do think that it represents something that, say, Martha Nussbaum was very interested in, which was communities of identity and the ability for individuals to be members of communities of identity, where they could place their pride in a group, a social setting that had people that they can identify with and that have similar characteristics. For Nussbaum, this was actually one of the means goods necessary for the capacity for affiliation in society. Because, as an Aristotelian, she recognizes that our individual identities, in fact, grow from the societies that we're to be a part of. So, even if you are a libertarian and you want individualism, it might be that you have to allow, then, for social expressions that you disagree with, because that's exactly where people as individuals emerge from. Their identities are understood in terms of their membership in various categories and various societies. There's also a special element of this in feminist protests. So especially feminist protests that explicitly celebrate the female body, and at times by doing topless protests and things like that. Now, on a surface level, this can be a reaction just to the fact that men don't have to wear shirts and are allowed to be more free with, say, their own bodies than females are. But we also ought to remember that this goes even deeper, because it goes all the way back to a cultural element that we can see in Plato and Aristotle and repeated all the way down, that identifies rationality with the male and irrationality and body with the female, and then deprecates irrationality, emotion, sentiment, and body in favor of rationality, mind. Well, in some ways, contemporary feminist protests are exactly challenging that dichotomy. By celebrating the body, they're coming back and saying, you know what, we are embodied people. We like our bodies. Don't deprecate them, don't look down upon them, and don't think about them as objects that should be used by you as the reason, but rather take them as ends. Take them as things that ought to be valued in themselves and not corrupted. So in some ways, in those embodied protests, there's a lot of philosophy going on. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter actually wore the Black Lives Matter shirt earlier when I was talking about Frederick Douglass. So when black protesters produced the slogan Black Lives Matter, there was a reaction to it that claimed, well, all lives matter. And then there was another reaction to it that was the Blue Lives Matter movement. Well, it's helpful if we think about what each of these slogans particularly means. So I think this goes back in part to that original question of whether there actually is racism in our society. When protesters put forward the claim that Black Lives Matter, what they were asserting was not that black lives are more significant than other lives, but rather asserting that black lives have not been treated as if they matter. The assumption behind this is that there is an ongoing process of racism and structural racism and implicit bias and all of that in our society. So a metaphor that's been used in order to explain this is, well, imagine that we all sit down at a dinner party and everybody else gets served food, but I don't get served any food. Well, if I say, hey, I deserve food, and the person next to me who's already eating leans over and says, well, we all deserve food. Well, in the one sense, I mean, that's entirely true. It might be that you all deserve food, but that claim about all of you is irrelevant given the particular case that I don't have food in front of me. So the basic claim of protesters who put forward Black Lives Matter is that they've been left without things in our society that other people have, and that if we're going to take them seriously, that their lives matter, that they need to be recognized with their rights. Now, I suspect that if we're going to ascribe rational motives to all lives matter people, their claim underneath is that racism actually doesn't exist today. And so we don't need to spend special time paying attention to the issues of minorities or women or any other group, because everything's just fair as it sits. And so claiming that Black Lives Matter is a way of asserting the superior importance of black people over other people. And again, this goes back to the question of what's the original state that we're actually dealing with. Do racism and sexism exist or not? Now, the relationship between Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter is a little bit more complicated, because the Black Lives Matter movement arose in part as a reaction to some actions by the police that certain members of the society took to be racist in one way or another. And this is not an abstract thing for those of us in Missouri. If you're familiar with St. Louis and Ferguson, I mean, this was right here at home that this stuff was going on. So since this had to do with racism internal to the police, some police felt accused by this. And it wasn't helpful that a few months into the protest, there were in fact a couple police officers killed by somebody who claimed affiliation with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so some people came to think of Black Lives Matter primarily as an anti-police movement. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement was actually much more diffuse than I think many people had imagined. There was no central organization for Black Lives Matter at the time, and claiming that you were affiliated with them just meant that you agreed with them somewhat. So most members of Black Lives Matter were certainly not in favor of killing police officers or anything like that. But they did want to raise questions about the justice of the situation in our society, how police officers carry themselves and how they're distributed through cities and how the structures around all of that works. Unfortunately, in some ways, these things bubble up most when there is a centralizing occasion for them to. And so there were specific cases in which the issue of police and racism were brought up, when the issues at stake were much broader than any of those particular occasions. So we have to keep in mind that, say, the black people in Ferguson perceive things through the lens of people who are involved in these structures of injustice and racism in our society, who have experienced implicit and probably explicit bias because of their race, who have been pulled over more than white people because there's more policing in their neighborhood and because possibly of implicit and explicit bias. And so when they see a particular occurrence, they expect that this will in fact involve racism, whereas most of the non-black people, say not from Ferguson, might look at this and not assume that racism's involved, even if this is a product of their privilege. They tend not to see this as an issue of race. And so then it comes down to a particular set of issues, and did this police officer do this or have this motive, and all sorts of kind of particular questions that are appropriate when you're doing a court case, and as a matter of fact, I think are significant questions that we ought to ask of lots of different interactions between the police, but it ignores that this is embedded in a much broader issue of justice. Now, I'm not going to resolve all of the issues here, much less the issues in particular instances, but I do want to raise the overall question: what can you do to address systematic injustice and implicit bias in these situations in a way that could in fact respect both police forces and the people that they're policing? What could you do to come up with more effective means of not separating these two, but in fact finding ways that they can cooperate with each other? This leads us back to the question of racial blindness. So should we as a society be moving to the point that we just stop talking about race and get beyond the whole thing? Well, here again, a lot's going to hang on whether you think racism is a real thing in society, whether you think that institutions and implicit bias and the such are actually still at work. If there is racism, then there's no way that you can address it without talking about it. This is the case especially if this is structural, if it's built into structures, and if it's implicit, because you're going to have to raise to consciousness the fact that these structures exist. Because people don't recognize all the ways that they might be implicated in these structures. And if this is accurate, then race blindness, not paying attention to race, actually ends up as a way of perpetuating systems of racism and racial injustice. Because if you're unable to see black people, for instance, you're unable to see the ways in which the system treats black people unjustly. So in the end, we end up with a couple of different options for us. I think traditionally there's been a way of thinking about these things that was, since like racism is bad and sexism is bad, what we need to do is just stop thinking in terms of racism and stop thinking in terms of sexism. And this would lead us to like what we thought was non-racism and non-sexism. And that's a kind of neutral term. You don't have to do anything to be non-sexist. You don't have to do anything in order to be non-racist. Just don't explicitly go out and be racist or sexist. But if it's the case that racism and sexism are in fact embedded into the structures of our society, and that there's built in, even into our minds, kind of thought and cultural bases for this, then non-racism and non-sexism are insufficient, really. You've got to be active against these things if you want to get rid of racism. So instead of non-racism, we need to move to something like anti-racism. And instead of non-sexism, we need to move to something like feminism, even if that word creeps you out. That's something like the kind of thing we would have to do, because just not doing anything doesn't actually get rid of the problem. Now, having said that, and having argued for an active stance in response to racism and sexism, we need to say something else, because there is a danger here of victimization. Both in the sense that you make, say, women and minorities just feel like victims and feel like their agency has been taken away, and in the sense that if you want to be active in this, that you just come through and suggest that you're going to take over and run things, thus compounding a kind of lack of agency amongst women and minorities. I take it that this is why the virtue of industry has often been emphasized by reformers in minority traditions. And we go back to Frederick Douglass, and as we're going to see, just some of his immediate followers, the virtue of industry, that idea that you could succeed if you put the work in, was important to them. In part because they didn't want to undercut the agency of these people that they were trying to empower. But it's also true that that's not really enough to get help, because simply telling people that they have to work hard doesn't actually even out the field. You're going to have to do more than that to get to effectively equal opportunities in the society. Now, the ideal solution to this would be actual integration, which is scary to a lot of people, but the idea of actually figuring out how to integrate your society, not just in terms of schools or things like that, but how do you actually break up ghettoized existence? How do you diversify your friends so that your approach to, say, racism and sexism isn't just an external approach, but is in fact built into relationships that you have with other people. So it's not artificial, and it doesn't break down the agency of somebody else, because you're not just showing up there. So effective integration is actually what, I would see as a kind of solution to this problem, but saying it's a lot easier than achieving it. And that's true both for myself and for society in general. Okay, so that's my series of lectures on racism and sexism. Hopefully this has given you a good background as we're going from here to some of the figures that are important in contemporary pushes for greater equality for race and sex. So we'll go on and we'll look at, from here, Malcolm X and Bell Hooks as we continue on our march to the end of the class. I'll see you next time.